Hey everybody, and welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and today we will be diving into the Green New Deal for public schools. But before we get into the main part of the episode, I want to take a minute to clarify something. While the subject matter of this show is public education in New York City, and I am an employee of the DOE, this is not, I repeat, not a DOE show. What this means is that I am editorially independent, all the views I express on the show are my own, and nothing about the show is being released in any official capacity. Once again, the show has no affiliation with the DOE. Now, on to the Green New Deal for public schools. Perhaps you have heard of the Green New Deal. It's been a talking point for politicians on both sides of the aisle for the past few years, and thus has a higher profile than the newer Green New Deal for public schools. In this week's episode, we will spend some time exploring both the Green New Deal and the Green New Deal for public schools so that we can come to an understanding of how they relate to one another. Before we attend to the Green New Deal, however, we should spend some time with its namesake, the original New Deal, or New Deal Classic, which was a series of federal programs initiated between 1933 and 1939 meant to address the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the result of wild, unregulated speculation in the stock market that crashed the U.S. economy and saw a quarter to a third of the U.S. labor base out of work, possibly as many as 15 million people. To make matters worse, intensive cultivation in the agricultural Southern Plains region destroyed the topsoil and set the stage for a drought and massive dust storms beginning in 1930. This ecological disaster, known as the Dust Bowl, uprooted farmers across the region, creating roughly 2.5 million ecological refugees. U.S. industrial production fell by about 50%, and much of the food, clothing, and other goods that were produced were not distributed because they could not be transported and sold profitably. Housing, likewise, went to waste when tenants were evicted, yet no new tenants came along who were able to pay rent. The U.S. government and the leaders of industry had no idea what to do about the Depression. Henry Ford claimed that the problem was that laborers had grown lazy. Meanwhile, he had also laid off nearly 3/4 of his workers. President Hoover was similarly clueless and not up to the challenge of reversing the Depression. And as a result, he lost in a landslide to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1932 presidential election. The New Deal had to be a massive and multifaceted thing in order to address such a huge crisis. It comprised both laws passed by Congress and executive orders made during FDR's first term. It attended to both the ecological crisis of the Dust Bowl and the financial crisis that led to the Depression. The Agricultural Adjustment Act permitted the federal government to purchase livestock from farmers and subsidize farmers to leave fields fallow, and thus reduce the agricultural surplus. This allowed prices to bounce back after the bottom had fallen out of the agricultural market due to overproduction. Programs such as the Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority employed young men on a grand scale and resulted in major projects in needed infrastructure. The Works Progress Administration made the federal government the largest employer in the country, providing over 8.5 million jobs and expanding public infrastructure with 1.4 million projects, including things like libraries, parks, and schools. It also funded artists to create new works of art. Thousands of writers, painters, and musicians were funded, leading to something of a renaissance in the production of American art. Murals and sculptures went up in public spaces, hundreds of books and pamphlets were written and published, and people who had never attended a concert or theatrical production were able to take part in the arts. Imagine being able to support oneself as an artist with the help of a government paycheck. New financial safeguards like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation restored public faith in the banks, and the Social Security Act established our social security system, which acts as a safety net for when we are unable to work and/or when we reach retirement age. Essentially, the New Deal empowered the federal government to pick up after laissez-faire capitalism. Unregulated capital crashed the American economic system, and the New Deal permitted the federal government to employ the workers who had been left without any other options when the system failed. Though the projects undertaken by the New Deal programs in many cases were referred to as make-work projects, just a cursory glance at the New Deal map, which can be found at livingnewdeal.org, reveals that a staggering amount of our public infrastructure was built in the decade that the PWA, WPA, CCC, and CWA operated. Just looking at my neighborhood, the bridge that I bike over to get to work, the beautiful 50-meter pool at my local public park, the park itself, and the public library around the corner are PWA, WPA, and CWA projects, respectively. If you haven't heard of that map or checked it out before, I highly recommend it. The legacy of these projects is omnipresent throughout the country. Opponents of New Deal programs at the time, people who had been relatively unaffected by the financial collapse and who had not faced the prospect of starving while searching for work, claimed that it was a government overreach. They were a part of or representative of the class with sufficiently diversified capital that a financial collapse would not threaten them as concretely as the prospect of a working class pried loose from the whims of private capital. So now let's return to the present day. Our financial system is locked in a pattern of steep growth and recession, with workers losing more of their relative share of capital every day. With the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in 2008, a byproduct of insufficiently regulated capital, and the financial chain reaction that followed, nearly 9 million Americans lost their jobs and over 10 million lost their homes. The sheer volume of foreclosures on a class of people who invest the vast majority of their wealth in their homes made this one of the largest, if not the largest, redistributions of wealth in American history, leaving 46.5 million Americans living below the poverty line 4 years after the fact. The average American has yet to fully recover from 2008, and the COVID-19 pandemic has heaped even more adversity on the plate of the working class. In the past year and a half, it has grown even harder to secure stable employment, and those who do have work have repeatedly been put in harm's way in an only partially closed and then prematurely reopened, as we're finding now, service sphere. The parallel between the financial events leading up to the original New Deal and those leading up to the Green New Deal is clear, but there is also an ecological parallel. The Dust Bowl was a result of intensive cultivation of farmland and drought conditions. Climate change is the result of intensive production and consumption of carbon-based fuels. In both cases, it is an overconsumption that is based less on need and more on unrealistic expectations for growth in financial markets. The impacts of the Dust Bowl on working people, hunger, adverse health effects, and exploitative working conditions are what much of the world will face and what many already are facing as climate change uproots people from throughout the global south and condemns them to lives as climate refugees. There can be no doubt that the climate crisis is dire, and we are running out of time to do something about it. Fortunately, we have a model for legislation that worked in the past when we faced a similar crisis. The Green New Deal is not a direct analog to the original New Deal, but is rather something of an amorphous platform that draws from the spirit of the New Deal and combines it with the recognition that we are facing a climate crisis. The term Green New Deal originates in an article by Thomas L. Friedman in the January 17, 2007 edition of the New York Times entitled "A Warning from the Garden." In the years that followed, there was a fair amount of discussion over and international calls for a Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal that has been on everybody's mind for the past several years is the non-binding resolution introduced to Congress by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey on February 7th, 2019. Not long after the resolution was introduced, Republicans began wielding it as a cudgel against the Democrats. Conservative commentator Sebastian Gorka, for example, claimed the Democrats would abolish cheeseburgers. Trump tweeted that the Green New Deal would eliminate planes and the military. Still, another rumor monger suggested that the Green New Deal would ensure financial security even for those unwilling to work. The thing about each of these statements is that they are entirely false. And what's funny is that the Green New Deal is not some dense piece of legalese that would take days to read through. In fact, it took me less than 10 minutes to get through it, and I'm a pretty slow reader. Most of the discussion on the right about the Green New Deal has nothing at all to do with the actual text of the document, which is logically organized, straightforward, and most importantly, non-binding, which means that it does not really do anything in and of itself. The sheer volume of falsehoods surrounding what might be one of the easiest texts in terms of reading comprehension ever to make it into Congress suggests to me that everyone should take a few minutes to read through the original. Just to be sure you get the SparkNotes version at the very least, though, and to guarantee you will be impervious to the next argument you hear from a relative who watches too much cable news, I will share some highlights with you. The text of the Green New Deal opens with the invocation of two reports. The Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the November 2018 Fourth National Climate Assessment in order to establish the sense of climate-related urgency. Findings from these two reports establish that human activity is the dominant cause of climate change over the last century. Climate change is causing sea level rise and increasingly severe wildfires, storms, droughts, and other extreme weather, and global warming above 2 degrees Celsius will result in each of the following: mass migration, over $500 billion in lost annual economic output in the United States in this century, wildfires that by 2050 will be twice as destructive as they used to be, the loss of 99% of the Earth's coral reefs, over 350 million more people to be exposed globally to deadly heat stress by 2050, and $1 trillion of damage to public infrastructure and coastal real estate in the United States. So, pretty serious. Preventing these outcomes would necessitate preventing global temperatures from passing the threshold at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrialized levels. This can be accomplished by aiming for a 40 to 60% cut in the 2010 level emissions globally by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. The really important and innovative thing that the Green New Deal does is relate the climate crisis to the economic and social justice crises we are facing in the US. It lists stagnating wages since the 70s, deindustrialization, and anti-labor policies, as well as the greatest income inequality since the 20s, as conditions that are exacerbated by the climate crisis, as the people who are most economically and socially vulnerable will be most directly impacted by the effects of climate change. Similarly, climate change is a threat multiplier when it comes to national security, since it impacts the economic, environmental, and social stability of countries and non-state actors around the world. Thus, if we must act decisively as a country in order to prevent the most serious consequences of climate change, then we might as well look for inspiration to the federal government-led mobilizations during World War II and the New Deal era that created the greatest middle class that the United States has ever seen. The resolution argues that this time, However, it is important to include members of vulnerable and frontline communities in the process. This is a key departure from the original New Deal. In that, back in the 30s and 40s, the Civilian Conservation Corps, just as one example, did employ Black men, but those jobs were capped at 10% of the entire workforce, and Black men were required to stay in segregated camps. The Green New Deal, in contrast, aims to create millions of good, high-wage jobs that will provide unprecedented levels of prosperity and economic security in the U.S., while in doing so, also counteracting systemic injustices. The premise thus logically established, it becomes the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, which does the following. Achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers. Create millions of good, high-wage jobs and ensure prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States. Invest in the infrastructure and industry of the United States to sustainably meet the challenges of the 21st century. Secure the following for all people of the United States for generations to come. Clean air and water, climate and community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment. And finally, promote justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of Indigenous people, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth. These being the vulnerable and frontline communities referenced earlier. To accomplish these goals, the Green New Deal proposes a 10-year mobilization that would build resiliency against climate-related disasters, repair and upgrade U.S. infrastructure, meet 100% of the power demand in the U.S. through renewable energy, build or upgrade to smart power grids, upgrade and build new buildings to higher energy and water efficiency standards, spur growth in clean manufacturing in the U.S. and remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturing processes, do the same thing in the agricultural sphere, update transportation systems in the U.S. to eliminate emissions, make transit more affordable, and bring us into the 21st century with high-speed rail, restore natural ecosystems, and provide low-tech solutions for carbon storage like land preservation and afforestation, which is the opposite of deforestation, clean up hazardous waste and abandoned sites to make them viable for economic development and sustainability, and promote international exchange of tech, expertise, products, funding, and services so that the U.S. can benefit from all the progress that has been made internationally in fighting climate change. The exact nature of the projects implied by these proposals is deliberately vague, as this effort will require a portfolio of policy actions at every level of government. But the Green New Deal does stipulate that they must be developed through transparent and inclusive consultation, collaboration, and partnership with frontline and vulnerable communities, labor unions, worker cooperatives, civil society groups, academia, and businesses. These projects have to be holistic and take into account not only the environmental considerations, but also social considerations in ensuring that frontline and vulnerable communities are not adversely affected. They should come with resources, training, and education, as well as public investments in research and the development of new renewable energy technologies and industries, economic development, the diversification of industry, and the deepening of community ownership, particularly in areas that might otherwise struggle to transition away from carbon-intensive industries. The processes used to develop these projects should be democratic and participatory, and be inclusive of and led by frontline and vulnerable communities and workers. The jobs created should be unionized, safe, non-discriminatory. They should pay high wages and offer the benefits workers enjoy in the rest of the developed world, like paid leave and retirement security. They should be created in a context with trade rules, procurement standards, and border adjustments with strong labor and environmental protections to stem the flow of jobs and pollution overseas and to begin to rebuild domestic manufacturing here in the U.S. Projects should obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples for all decisions that affect Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories, honoring all treaties and agreements with Indigenous peoples, and protect and enforce the sovereignty and land rights of Indigenous peoples. So basically the opposite of the Keystone XL pipeline. They should crack down on unfair competition and domination by monopolies. Finally, all people of the U.S. should have access to high-quality healthcare, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, economic security, clean water and air, healthy and affordable food, and access to nature. At first, this seems like a tall order, but really, the Green New Deal is a statement of goals. Necessary goals, and the means by which we could go about accomplishing those goals as a country. Moreover, it references a time in which the federal government did essentially the same thing and simply updates it by suggesting that this time, when we do it, we should be sure that everybody gets to benefit and not just white men. As straightforward, logical, and non-binding as it is, the Senate Republicans forced a vote on it not long after it was introduced and shot it down. It was reintroduced this year, however, along with some actual legislation. Representatives Cori Bush and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have introduced a piece of legislation that would authorize $1 trillion for cities, tribes, and territories to fund their own localized Green New Deal projects. Senator Bernie Sanders and AOC are co-sponsoring legislation that would spend $172 billion on public housing over the next 10 years, and Ed Markey and AOC are co-sponsoring a proposal to create a new civilian conservation corps, like that of the original New Deal era, which would create 1.5 million jobs with good pay and benefits for a diverse group of workers over the course of 5 years. The Green New Deal is similar to the New Deal in that it is meant to be a blanket idea for a whole lot of policy, legislation, executive orders, and the like, that all fit together to address overlapping crises. The difference is that the crises in this case are climate change, economic disparity, and social inequality, and it will take a greater effort and more policy to address these crises. One piece of legislation that would fall under the Green New Deal blanket is the Green New Deal for public schools. This is Representative Jamaal Bowman's bill, and its premise is simple. If we are looking to do something about climate change, systemic racism, and economic inequality, we have to start in our schools. If anybody in Congress knows what schools need in new legislation, it's Representative Jamaal Bowman, who was an educator by profession before he was elected to the House of Representatives. He grew up in the city, started his career teaching at a public school in the Bronx, and was the founding principal of the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, which is a Bronx middle school. The Green New Deal for public schools would invest $1.4 trillion in K-12 schools over a 10-year period. About a third of the money would go towards upgrading the physical space of schools, transforming every public school in the country into a safe, healthy, zero-carbon, and accessible learning environment. This would involve retrofitting all of the falling apart schools in the country. Imagine the school where you teach, or where your child attends, or where you used to attend. Is there mold? Is there asbestos? Is it accessible to all the students, staff, and families? The Climate Capital Facilities grants would address all of that in the country's poorest third of schools, and then pitch in for the middle and richest thirds as well. Further, these grants would go towards eliminating carbon emissions through energy efficiency upgrades, on-site renewable energy installation, and green power procurement. They would also turn each school into a resiliency center, with investments from garden and tree planting to electric vehicle charging stations. Schools would become living labs for the Green New Deal, thus engaging students and families in experiences that will prepare them for the green jobs of tomorrow. Also through the Green New Deal for public education, $250 billion would go towards resource block grants, equipping schools to approach target student-to-staff ratios of 12-1 for grades K through 8 and 15-1 for high school. These grants would also be used to integrate local knowledge and community relationships in high-need schools and strengthen and diversify the educator pipeline, which is a topic that we will spend the next few episodes of this show discussing. $100 million would go towards an educational equity planning grants pilot program, the main goal of which being to address historic school funding inequities within different regions throughout the country. And finally, the bill would devote $695 billion to Title I and Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding. Overall, the Green New Deal for public schools would fund 1.3 million jobs per year and eliminate 78 million metric tons of CO2 annually, which, for perspective, is the same thing as taking 17 million cars off the road. The following is directly from an email I received the other day about the Green New Deal for public schools. Imagine kids across America learning in comfortable, healthy buildings, powered by rooftop solar panels, taught by well-paid teachers who aren't overworked or hounded by their own debt. Imagine hundreds of thousands of workers with good-paying jobs building, retrofitting, and maintaining those schools. On extremely hot and cold days, people shelter in this large, safe building. The school emits zero carbon, yes, but it's also a place where social connections and community resiliency are forged. That sounds pretty good to me. What are the next steps, you might be wondering? Well, there is an online kickoff announcement happening on August 10th, just a couple of days after this episode airs. If you are interested in hearing from Representative Bowman himself about strategy and what you can do as an educator, parent, student, or just a concerned citizen, you can find the link to that event in the episode description. Now, for this week's education-related news. The New York State United Teachers President, Andy Pallotta, issued a statement in response to the State Attorney General's findings regarding allegations of sexual misconduct against Governor Andrew Cuomo. The statement reads as follows. The Attorney General has detailed conduct that is repugnant and indefensible in any workplace, and especially in the state's highest elected office. Equally troubling was the governor's response to the report. Sadly, both show he is unfit to serve in office. In COVID-related news, cases continue to rise in New York City with the Delta variant surge in case count. This week, de Blasio said that workers and customers at restaurants, gyms, shows, and other forms of indoor non-essential entertainment would have to show proof of vaccination beginning on September 13th, which happens to be the day that we are supposed to go back to school. Also, if you have held out this long, but go get vaccinated now, you get a $100 incentive. Still no actual vaccination mandate for schools, though. Thank you, dear listener, for spending the past half hour with me. I hope this has been informative and at least a little entertaining. If you are enjoying what you're hearing and want to hear more of it, be sure to check out patreon.com/professional development, where a mere $3 per month will afford you at least 2 bonus episodes. For a totally free way to support the show, be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you use for listening to podcasts, and consider leaving a nice review or 5-star rating, or both. To keep the conversation going, send an email to professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com, and I will be sure to get back to you. Thanks again, and see you back, same time, same place, next week.